The subject of this video is Yom Kippur and the questioning of God's judgment. The obvious question is, what's the connection between Yom Kippur and the questioning of God's judgment? So in order to explain the connection, I want to cite a Hasidic teaching. The Hasidic movement is a movement that began in Judaism in the 19th century in Eastern Europe. It's a form of Jewish mysticism. So there's a Hasidic teaching. It says, it asks why the biblical term is Yom Kippurim in the plural. The term Yom Kippur is in the singular. It literally means a day of atonement. And the biblical term is in the plural, Yom Kippurim, a day of atonements. So the Hasidic teaching that says that the reason that the biblical term is plural, Yom Kippurim, is that not only do we as human beings need to make atonement for our sin and wrongdoing, but God as well needs to make atonement. And this is a very, very radical idea. But it's a very radical idea that is, in my view, very, very faithful to the biblical spirit. It's an idea that's deeply rooted in the Bible. It's a fundamental idea of the Bible that we question God's judgment. And this is what I want to examine in this video, then, is the roots of this idea in the Bible that we question God's judgment. Not only is the questioning of God's judgment not seen as heretical or forbidden, but this is a fundamental idea of the Bible. And notice that also flowing from this idea of questioning God's judgment, it means that if God is not above questioning and criticism, then no human being and no societal institution is above questioning and above criticism. And moral social criticism is something that is very, very characteristic of the Bible as literature. Indeed, in other ancient Near Eastern literatures, you do not find such moral and social criticism to such an extent as in the Bible. And the great prophets, especially the great prophets of the Bible, question and voice criticism of the kings of ancient Israel, of the priesthood and the temple cult, the temple being the central religious institution of ancient Israel, where animal sacrifices were performed, and the prophets were critical, voiced criticism of the priesthood and the animal sacrifices. So that in the Bible, no human being is above questioning, above criticism, no societal institution is above questioning and criticism. And that comes from this idea that we question God's judgment, and God is not above questioning and above criticism. So the paradigm then, the model, the paradigm of questioning God's judgment, and this is the beginning of the origins of the idea in the Bible, is with Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, God has decreed to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for their wickedness. Abraham argues with God, questions God's judgment. He utters very harsh words. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? And Rashi, the great commentator of the Jewish tradition, lived in the 11th century. Rashi, when Abraham begins to argue, it's written that he approaches God. And Rashi says that the word approach there in the Bible, among other things, means to approach to make war. That Abraham is actually fighting with God, according to Rashi. Rashi says he utters very harsh words. So that according to Rashi, Abraham is fighting with God, uttering harsh words. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? And the name of the Jewish people in the Bible, the main biblical name of the Jewish people is the name Israel, that word we have, people Israel. If we divide the name in the middle, it literally means righteous of God. That will be a people, the Jewish people, a people devoted to righteousness. But The literal meaning of the term Israel means to wrestle with God. It comes from the story of Jacob in the book of Genesis, chapter 32. If you look in verse 29, Jacob, it's the story where Jacob wrestles with, called a man. He wrestles with a man, but according to the book of Hosea in the Bible, the prophet Hosea, it's the angel of God, and that Jacob is wrestling with. And the angel of God says to Jacob that he will be called Israel. This will be his name, the name of the Jewish people, Israel. And the angel says, because he has wrestled with God and with men. Ki sarita im Elohim v'adam. Sarita there means, which is where the name Israel comes from, it means to wrestle. To wrestle with God is so that the idea of questioning God's judgment is the very essence of our name, the name of the Jewish people, the people of Israel. And Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, exemplifies this, that we question God's judgment. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham exemplifies this. Now, also regarding Abraham, the rabbis compared Abraham to Noah. Noah, in the story of the flood, when God has decreed to destroy the entire world, Noah, the name Noah means, in Hebrew, it's actually Noach. It means content, self-satisfied. Noach is content, self-satisfied that he and his family will survive. He doesn't utter a word of protest. He doesn't argue with God like Abraham in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the rabbis were very critical of that. It's written at the beginning of the story that Noach is righteous in his generation. That in his generation, not in comparison with Abraham. He's righteous only in his generation. He doesn't argue with God like Abraham. And also it's written there that Noach walks with God. At the beginning of chapter 6, toward the beginning of chapter 6 there, at the beginning of the story of Noah, it's written that Noah walks, in the book of Genesis chapter 6, he walks with God. In the book of Genesis chapter 17, the very beginning of the chapter, it's written of Abraham, that Abraham walks before God. And notice that Noah, in walking with God, the images of Noah is like a small child is dependent on God. Doesn't question God. A small child doesn't question the authority of his parent, of his father. And Noah, walking with God, his father above, as it were, Noah doesn't question God. He doesn't utter a word of protest. He's like a small child. But Abraham walks before God. Abraham is independent. And actually in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, before Abraham approaches God to argue, it's God who actually consults with Abraham. And God says, can I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? And in decreeing to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God, as it were, consults with Abraham. As it were, invites Abraham to argue with him, because the image of Abraham is not a small child. Abraham is the child of God, of his father above. But Abraham is the child of God, but not a child. The images of Abraham is as an adult. And that God can consult with Abraham then and actually invites Abraham to argue with him. So this is Abraham. Also Moses. Moses goes even further than Abraham, because Moses, in the story of the golden calf, the making of the golden calf, when God decrees to destroy then the Israelite people, Moses not only argues with God, and this is in the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verses 7 to 14. Moses not only argues with God, Moses demands that God rescind the decree to destroy the Jewish people. And he says, turn from your fierce anger and repent of this evil against your people. And notice that he says, he calls the decree of God evil, questions God's judgment, and says the decree is evil. But he says, turn from your fierce anger. And the word that appears there is shuv. It's the same root as the word tshuva, a central word of the Jewish tradition. That tshuva is often, it's a central concept of the Jewish tradition. It's often, the term is inadequately translated as repentance. It literally means return. It's a return to the path of right living. And the notion of sin in Judaism, in Hebrew, the word sin in Hebrew comes from a word that means missing of the mark. That sin in the Bible and in Judaism is a missing of the mark. It's a falling down, that we make a mistake or we commit wrongdoing. There is no notion whatsoever in the Bible or traditional Judaism of original sin in the Christian sense of being born into sin. We're not born into sin in the Bible and in Judaism. Sin is a missing of the mark, that we fall down, we make mistakes, we commit wrongdoing. And tshuva means we have to pick ourselves up off the ground and get ourselves back onto the path of right living. And tshuva is a central concept then of the Bible and the Jewish tradition that's incumbent upon us at all times to return to the path of right living. But the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim are especially devoted to tshuva. We call them the 10 days of tshuva. Remember that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim are days of awe according to the Jewish tradition. Days of awe, the word awe in Hebrew comes from the same root as the word fear, like fear of God. It's a time when we're standing before God in judgment, in fear and trembling. So Rosh Hashanah is the day of judgment, Yom Kippur the day of atonement. But during this period, we're standing before God in judgment, in fear and trembling, days of awe, and the days are connected, the 2 days of awe of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, by the 10 days of tshuva, a time especially devoted to tshuva, that we're standing before God in judgment, we're to examine ourselves and to return to the path of right living. And to go back then to the verse, Moses says to God, turn, actually means return to the path. Notice again, here we see clear roots of this Hasidic teaching that not only Yom Kippurim in the plural, not only do we as human beings need to make atonement, God needs to make atonement. And this is what Moses says, return, tshuva. Moses demands of God, as it were, to do tshuva, return to the path of right living, repent of this evil. He questions God's judgment. Return to the path of right living, turn from your fierce anger and repent of this evil. And at the end then of the passage, it says that God turns from his fierce anger, repents of the evil, and rescinds the decree. Okay. So, these are our greatest figures then in the Bible. Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, and Moses, our greatest prophet, both of them question God's judgment. So now what I want to do in the continuation of this video is I want to examine one other issue. And that is the contradiction in Abraham. If we go back to Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. That Abraham, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, regarding wicked people, argues with God, utters very harsh words, will the judge of all the earth not do justice? And yet, in the story of the binding of Isaac, which is chapter 22 in the book of Genesis, in the story of the binding of Isaac, when Abraham is asked to offer as a sacrifice his beloved son Isaac, innocent of wrongdoing, he's utterly silent. Now, this contradiction, I'm not going to be able to deal with it in depth in the remaining time in this video. I'll only be able to deal with it very briefly. But I've written a book on the subject, and it's recently been published, called Reconciling a Contradictory Abraham, where I deal with the question in depth. And at the very beginning of my book, I say that the silence of Abraham in the story of binding of Isaac it's deafening. It demands explanation. Okay, so I at least want to address the issue briefly here. That tell a Hasidic story again, another Hasidic teaching. There's the story of a rabbi who was having a discussion with his students, and the rabbi says, to his students, he says, everything in God's creation has some purpose, some reason. Nothing is arbitrary. So one of the students asks, well, tell me, Rabbi, he says, what's the purpose of atheism, of the denial of God? And the rabbi says that atheism indeed has a very important purpose. He says the denial of God. He says, when it comes to our own suffering, okay, when it comes to our own suffering, the rabbi says, then we have to have complete faith in God. We have to accept what God has imposed upon us with a joyful heart. Here I'm adding, in parentheses, a joyful heart doesn't mean we're going to sing and dance. It means we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens and to continue living in the face of adversity. We're not going to fall into a despair or depression. We're going to see the cup as half full, to see our adversity as an opportunity to grow as a human being, as a way of growing, of building our character. And so that we're not going to fall into a despair or depression. We're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens. We're not going to sing and dance in the face of our suffering, but we're going to reconcile ourselves with the heavens and continue living and not fall into a despair or depression. So the rabbi says, when it comes to our own suffering, we have to have complete faith in God and to accept our suffering with a joyful heart and what's imposed upon us. But, the rabbi says, when it comes to the suffering of others, says, then we have to deny God. There can be no God. No other human being can help regarding the suffering of others, and there's no God who can help. It depends entirely upon us. So this is Abraham. Abraham, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's dealing with the suffering of others. And he argues with God on behalf of others. As he as it were, denies God as God, denies God's transcendence. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? He denies God's transcendence as a source of absolute judgment, absolute knowledge, absolute truth and justice. Abraham holds God accountable to his own standard of justice. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? He doesn't say, as in the words of Isaiah the prophet, Isaiah says that God says, Isaiah says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. Abraham doesn't say that. He rejects, as it were, God's transcendence and holds God accountable to his own standard of justice. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? That's to deny God, as the absolute source of justice. So that Abraham, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, is dealing with the suffering of others, and he argues with God. In the story of the binding of Isaac, it's his own suffering that's the focus. It's true there may be suffering of others as well, especially Isaac, in being offered up as a sacrifice. But the focus of the story is that it's a character test of Abraham, and God tested Abraham. It imposed a trial upon him, as it were, a very harsh test. But it's a character test that Abraham's going to build his character through this test, or his character is going to be built, and he's going to grow as a person as a result of this test. And the word test there can also mean like an experience that he's being given to grow from. So it's a very harsh test, but it's a test in which he's going to grow as a person. And there, when it's his own suffering, Abraham is silent. Now, one other thing here, and that is the comparison between Abraham and Job. And the comparison it's a parallel. The parallel is drawn by the book of Job itself. In the book of Job, in chapter 42, the very last chapter of the book, Job says, I'm only dust and ashes. And this phrase is a central phrase in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham says, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, in the midst of his arguing with God, of uttering very harsh words, will the judge of all the earth not do justice? In the midst of his arguing with God, he says, I'm only dust and ashes. So, if Abraham is aware that he's only dust and ashes, he's aware of his own subjectivity, the limitations of his judgment as a human being. He's aware that his judgment is limited and subjective. He's only dust and ashes. What should follow from that? That he should be silent. He shouldn't argue. But he should say, like in the words of Isaiah, that God says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. But Abraham doesn't say that. He says, I'm only dust and ashes, and he continues to argue with God and holds God accountable to his own subjective standard of justice. Will the judge of all the earth not do justice? He argues with God in a very respectful way, but he continues to argue with God even though he's aware of his own subjectivity. That's something very remarkable. Now, Job, by contrast, Job, the awareness that he's dust and ashes is not a self-awareness as in the case of Abraham. Abraham himself is aware, a self-awareness that he's only dust and ashes, and he continues to argue with God. Job, the awareness that he's dust and ashes is imposed upon him by God. It's God who imposes this awareness. If you go back to the beginning of the story, also it's a kind of a test of Job. God has given Job suffering. Job suffers terrible suffering in the loss of his property, his health, the loss of children. And even though he's a righteous person, and Job argues with God. Job accuses God of injustice. But notice the difference between Job and Abraham. Abraham is arguing with God on behalf of others, wicked people of Sodom and Gomorrah. He argues with God on behalf of others, the suffering of others. Job is arguing with God regarding his own suffering. Abraham, regarding his own suffering, and whereas his suffering is the focus in the story of the binding of Isaac, is silent. It's as if he accepts the decree of God with a joyful heart again, not in the sense that he's going to sing and dance, but he's reconciling himself with the heavens, and he doesn't argue Abraham. Job, regarding his own suffering, contrast to Abraham, argues with God. He accuses God of injustice. And God comes to answer Job. And it begins in chapter 38 in the book of Job, when God answers Job out of the storm wind. Now, the book of Job, in my mind, is widely misunderstood as if it's a philosophic work. It is not a philosophic work. It's not coming to address a philosophic question of why do the righteous suffer, or why doesn't God prevent the suffering of the righteous. That's not the question of the book. And notice that the answer that God gives to Job isn't any kind of a philosophic answer. What God does is to silence Job. God says to Job, in effect, who are you, a mere creature? You're not the creator of the universe, a mere creature. Who are you to question God? God imposes God's transcendence upon Job. You're a creature, and standing before God. Who are you to question God? It's the awareness then, that Job comes to the awareness that he's only dust and ashes, has been imposed upon him by God. Why? Because the focus of the book is psychological, not philosophical. And this is revealed at the very beginning of the book and repeated at the end of the book. That why did the friends of Job come to Job? They come to him as friends to comfort him, to help him overcome his suffering. And they actually defeat their purpose, because what do they do in coming to comfort him? They blame him, in effect, for his suffering, which isn't very comforting. They tell him, you must have committed some sin and wrongdoing. It can't be that you're suffering arbitrarily, that God is arbitrary. There must be some justification for your suffering. You've committed some sin or wrongdoing. And at the end of the story, God, and this is repeated again, that the friends came to Job to help him, to overcome his suffering. And they defeat their own purpose. And it's God who, at the end of the story in chapter 42, criticizes Job's friends, not Job. Notice, Job is not criticized for questioning God's judgment. It's Job's friends who are criticized, who defend God and criticize Job for questioning God. It's the friends of God who are criticized. God says to the friends of Job, you didn't speak rightly to me as Job did. Job is the one who speaks rightly by questioning God. So why does God silence Job? Because the central concern of the book is psychological, to help Job overcome his suffering. And that's why God comes to answer Job, like the friends, to help him overcome his suffering. And so from a psychological point of view, if Job continues to criticize, to complain, and to criticize, and to accuse God of injustice, he will only fall into a deep despair and depression. Notice that God doesn't silence Job immediately, allows Job to pour out his soul. If he doesn't accept the judgment of God immediately, like Abraham in the story of binding of Isaac. Abraham doesn't question. He immediately accepts the judgment imposed upon him with a joyful heart. And he doesn't question. Abraham reconciles himself with the heavens. Job doesn't reconcile himself immediately. But there's no hint in the story that his questioning of God's judgment is heretical or forbidden. God, in fact, is critical again of the friends of Job and not Job. But there comes a point where God has to silence Job in order that he doesn't fall into a depression or despair, that Job can then accept upon him this awareness that with Abraham it's a self-awareness. God imposes it upon Job that he's only dust and ashes for Job's own good, that Job can then reconcile himself with the heavens, accept with a joyful heart his suffering upon him. Not that he's going to sing and dance again, but he's not going to fall into a despair or a depression. He's going to continue living. It's then that God restores to Job. Once Job reconciles himself with the heavens, then at the end of the story in chapter 42, God returns to Job, restores to him his property, his health, and gives him new children, that the message that he then can continue living once he's reconciled himself with the heavens. So this is the comparison then of Abraham and Job. So what we see then is that the questioning of God's judgment is not only not seen as heretical or forbidden in the Bible. This is the very essence of the biblical spirit, reflected in the name Israel, to wrestle with God. And this is what Abraham exemplifies, is questioning God's judgment when? In the suffering of others. When it comes to his own suffering, the story of the binding of Isaac is test of his character. He accepts God's suffering with a joyful heart, reconciles himself with the heavens. And in the case of Job, who does question God regarding his own suffering, even then it's not seen as heretical or forbidden. God allows Job to pour out his soul, a kind of catharsis, and then God silences Job only in order to help him to reconcile, to accept upon himself that he's only dust and ashes, reconcile himself with the heavens, and continue living. This is so that the idea then of questioning God's judgment is deeply, deeply rooted in the Bible. Thank you.